in the winter of 2009, in a small town in northern Japan. A wild deer walked out of the tree line, crossed an open field in broad daylight, and stopped directly in front of a farmhouse. It didn't run. It didn't startle when the door opened. It stood there, trembling, one leg held awkwardly off the ground, and waited. The farmer who found it said later that it looked at him the way a person looks at someone they've decided, for reasons they can't fully explain, to trust completely. He found a deep wire snare cutting into the animal's leg, the kind poachers leave behind and rarely check. He worked for almost 20 minutes to free it. The deer didn't struggle once. When it was finally loose, it didn't bolt into the trees the way every instinct a wild deer has should have demanded. It stood for several seconds, looking at him, before walking away, slowly, almost reluctantly, glancing back twice before disappearing into the tree line for good. This actually happened. It's one of dozens of strikingly similar documented cases from completely different countries, completely different species, and completely different circumstances. And once you start collecting them side by side, a deeply strange pattern starts to emerge. Wild animals, creatures with every conceivable evolutionary reason to treat humans as the single most dangerous predator on the entire planet. A species that hunts them, traps them, displaces them, and has shaped their fear response for thousands of generations. Sometimes do something that makes absolutely no sense on paper. When everything goes wrong, when they're injured, trapped, or dying, they walk directly toward us. Not away, not toward another member of their own species, which would at least make some intuitive evolutionary sense. Toward us, the exact species most responsible for making their lives difficult in the first place. So why does this happen? Why would a wild deer, a wild dolphin, a wild elephant, a wild bird, none of whom have any obvious reason whatsoever to extend trust toward humans, sometimes decide in their single most desperate moment that we are exactly the right creature to approach? The answer involves some genuinely serious published research, a handful of competing scientific theories that are still actively debated, and a collection of documented cases so specific and so strange that some of them sound more like folklore than field biology, except they're not folklore. They're verified, photographed, and in several cases, formally studied by researchers who set out specifically to understand what's actually happening inside these animals' heads when they make that choice. Stay with this one, because by the end, you're going to look at every weird animal video you've ever scrolled past completely differently. Let's start with the most rigorously tested example in this entire story, because unlike almost everything else we're about to cover, this one isn't just anecdotal. It's been measured, replicated, and published in one of the most respected scientific journals on Earth. Across sub-Saharan Africa, there's a small bird called the greater honey guide, with an extremely inconvenient problem. It loves beeswax and bee larvae more than almost anything else, but it has absolutely no way of breaking into a defended beehive by itself. Bees are dangerous in large numbers, hives are aggressively guarded, and a bird with no tools and no fire has no real chance of getting past that defense alone. Humans, on the other hand, are remarkably good at subduing bees and cracking open a hive safely using smoke and tools. But humans are frankly terrible at finding the hives in the first place. They're hidden deep inside trees, scattered across enormous, dense stretches of bush that would take a person days to search alone. The honey guide solves both problems in one elegant move. It locates the hive using senses and instincts humans simply don't have, then flies toward a human honey hunter, calling loudly and insistently, and physically leads that person, sometimes for over a mile through difficult terrain, directly to the hidden nest. The human opens the hive, takes the honey, and leaves the wax and larvae behind, the part the bird actually wants and could never reach on its own. For decades, this was treated as a charming bit of folklore repeated in nature documentaries without much rigorous testing behind it. Then in 2016, researcher Claire Spottiswoode and her team ran a controlled experiment in Mozambique that changed that completely. Local honey hunters use a specific vocal call, passed down through generations, meant specifically to summon a honey guide's cooperation. When researchers played that exact call against other control sounds of equal volume and length, the results were dramatic. The specific cooperation call roughly doubled the probability of being led to a nest, and it nearly tripled the overall odds of successfully finding one. The bird wasn't simply reacting to noise. It was recognizing one specific signal among many and attaching real, functional meaning to it. This sound means this human wants to work with me right now, and it's worth my time to help them. This is, according to the researchers themselves, one of the only confirmed examples on Earth of a completely wild, undomesticated animal engaging in active, learned, two-way cooperation with humans through genuine communication, not tolerance, not training, not domestication, just a wild bird that figured out humans are useful partners and built an actual signal to recruit them. And that raises an uncomfortable question for the rest of this video. When a wild animal approaches a human for help, what is actually happening inside its head in that moment? Is it genuinely grasping in some real sense that humans specifically possess the ability to solve its specific problem? Or is something much simpler happening underneath? Something that only looks like understanding from where we're standing? Researchers studying this draw a careful line between a few different explanations, and they don't all require the same depth of thought from the animal. The simplest explanation is pure learned association. An animal has, at some point, personally experienced a human doing something helpful, and it generalizes that single experience to future moments of distress. This doesn't require any grasp of human intentions or separate minds at all. It just requires a basic reinforced link. Human plus distress equals relief, based purely on something it has personally lived through before. A more sophisticated explanation requires something closer to a basic theory of mind, some limited understanding that humans have their own separate goals and intentions, distinct from the animal's own experience. This is a much higher bar, and it's genuinely debated how many non-human species actually clear it. But there's real behavioral evidence, especially from domesticated species studied under controlled conditions, that at least some animals operate with something in this more advanced category. The clearest evidence comes from dogs, studied using mobile eye tracking technology during real interactions. Researchers have found dogs respond dramatically more strongly to a human pointing at something while also making direct eye contact than to either signal alone or to other movements that aren't deliberately communicative, like a fake throwing motion. When a human points while looking directly at the dog in what researchers call an ostensive manner, clearly signaling, "I am trying to tell you something right now," dogs track the referenced object with far more attention and approach it correctly far more often than chance would predict. The dog isn't reacting to motion. It's interpreting a gesture as meaningfully pointing towards something specific. That's the same basic skill human infants develop early in life, when they first understand that a pointing finger means "look at that thing" and not "look at my finger." That same skill, just running in reverse, may be exactly what happens when a distressed wild animal approaches a human. If an animal has even a rudimentary sense that humans are independent agents, capable of understanding a problem and acting on it, then deliberately approaching a person, instead of fleeing or hiding, becomes a genuinely intelligent, calculated decision, not a random accident. So let's actually look at the documented individual cases, because the breadth and specificity of these stories is what makes this topic so compelling to sit with. There's the case of a wild bottlenose dolphin off the coast of Hawaii that approached a group of scuba divers swimming in an unmistakably labored, impaired way, completely different from normal dolphin movement. Diving instructor Keller Laros initially followed the sensible rule of not interfering with marine animals. But the dolphin's behavior was distinct and persistent enough, circling back again and again instead of swimming away, that it became clear something was wrong. It had swallowed a fish hook with line wound tightly around its body, restricting its ability to swim and breathe. Laros carefully removed the hook and cut away the line. The dolphin didn't bolt the moment it was free, the way you'd expect. It surfaced for a breath, then deliberately came back, facing the diver directly in what witnesses widely interpreted as some kind of acknowledgement before finally swimming off for good. There's the case of a raven that perched on a fence outside a rural property and squawked persistently for over an hour, refusing to leave despite no one responding at first. When someone finally went outside to investigate, they found 4 porcupine quills embedded in its face and wing, clearly causing significant pain. The bird allowed a complete stranger to come close enough to remove all 4 quills one at a time, tolerating exactly the kind of sustained close contact every survival instinct it has should have told it to avoid completely. There's the case of an Indian elephant calf that fell into a deep man-made watering hole and couldn't climb out. The mother, in obvious escalating distress, approached a nearby road and made repeated, unmistakable overtures toward passing humans, refusing to wander off despite their initial confusion about what she wanted. She eventually led a group of people back to the hole, where they organized a rescue and pulled the calf safely out. There's the southern right whale off the coast of Sydney, entangled in a heavy mass of fishing line and plastic debris wrapped tightly around its mouth, that approached a small boat and repeatedly surfaced alongside it, until a teenager aboard was finally able to pull the debris free. There's the whale shark off the coast of Australia that swam directly up to a fishing boat and floated motionless for a full 20 minutes, while a diver carefully removed a rope wound tightly around its body. An animal the size of a school bus deliberately holding still for a stranger performing what was functionally surgery with no anesthesia and no restraint. And then there's the case of a mother elephant in Kenya, walking across the savannah with 2 companions, all 3 carrying poison-tipped arrows buried in their sides, courtesy of poachers. In agony, bleeding, with every reason on earth to avoid anything resembling a human for the rest of their lives, they walked directly toward a wildlife rescue center. Not away, toward it. One of the 3 had previously mated with a former orphan raised and released by that exact facility, meaning this elephant had somehow connected that specific patch of savanna and the species responsible for shooting her with the concept of help rather than harm. What's especially worth sitting with is that people who spend their careers working with injured wildlife report this exact pattern across an almost surprising range of species, not just the famously intelligent ones you'd expect, like elephants and dolphins. Rehabilitators at long-term sanctuaries have documented coyotes, wolves, bears, and cougars all showing the same basic pattern in genuine extremis, an animal that normally maintains real instinctive distance from humans, sometimes one with very limited prior contact, will approach and essentially solicit help during a moment of acute crisis in a way that looks distinctly different from its completely normal, wary day-to-day behavior. One particularly striking case involved 4 young wild deer, completely exhausted after attempting to swim across the dangerously icy waters of Stevens Passage off the coast of Alaska, clearly struggling and at real risk of drowning from hypothermia and exhaustion. Spotting a boat in the distance, all 4 swam directly toward it and were eventually pulled aboard, behavior that runs completely counter to every instinct a wild deer would normally have around an unfamiliar vessel full of unfamiliar primates. When the alternative is drowning alone in freezing water, the underlying calculation apparently shifts immediately, and whatever fear response usually keeps deer at a safe distance gets overridden by something far more urgent in that specific moment. This pattern, desperate circumstances overriding completely normal avoidance behavior, shows up again and again across nearly every documented case researchers have collected. It strongly suggests the baseline wariness wild animals show toward humans isn't some fixed, unbreakable rule etched permanently into their behavior. It's more accurately a default setting, carefully calibrated under ordinary conditions by countless generations of evolutionary pressure combined with individually learned caution. But default settings apparently can be overridden entirely when a situation becomes desperate enough that the calculated risk of approaching a human becomes smaller than the near certain risk of doing nothing at all. There's also a deeper evolutionary angle worth taking seriously here, one that goes well beyond any single animal's in-the-moment reasoning during one crisis. Some species may carry a longer, generationally inherited history with humans, specifically because their distant ancestors' occasional willingness to approach us under the right circumstances, produced beneficial outcomes often enough across generations to be reinforced and maintained over evolutionary time, even within populations that remain entirely wild and undomesticated in every other respect. The honey guide is by far the clearest example of this exact dynamic, running on a true evolutionary timescale rather than an individual one. An entire wild species developed a specific dedicated communication signal because cooperating with humans, generation after generation, paid off reliably enough to be worth maintaining as a stable inherited strategy. It's not that every individual honey guide consciously reasons through the decision each time. It's that the behavior itself proved useful enough, often enough, across enough birds and enough generations, to become a fixed feature of the species' entire behavioral repertoire. Something structurally similar may be happening, in a far less formalized way, with intelligent species like elephants, which possess remarkably long individual memories, sophisticated social learning, and a well-documented capacity to pass detailed knowledge down through extended family groups across generations of matriarchal leadership. An elephant population that has had genuinely positive experiences with a specific conservation organization, even indirectly through the experiences of related individuals elsewhere in the herd, may carry forward a kind of inherited, socially transmitted association. This particular type of human, in this particular place, has historically meant relief rather than danger. That's meaningfully different from some broad, universal trust extended toward humans as a species. It's a highly specific, narrowly conditional exception, carved out of an otherwise entirely rational, fully justified, general wariness. It's worth being genuinely honest about the real limits of what we can claim here with full scientific confidence. We cannot interview a dolphin, an elephant, or a deer about its exact internal state in the moment it chooses to approach a human. Researchers studying this are understandably cautious about over-interpreting observed behavior, fully aware of how easy it is for humans to project rich emotional narratives onto behavior that might, in cold scientific terms, be explained by something far simpler than a genuine cognitive grasp of human minds and intentions. An animal in extreme distress, exhausted, injured, and genuinely out of options, might simply be drawn toward relative stillness, toward large, unfamiliar structures like boats that represent novelty rather than immediate threat, toward the simple absence of any further danger signal in its environment, without necessarily possessing any deeper grasp of the specific idea that this particular human can solve its specific problem. But the honey guide case is genuinely different from the rest of these stories, because it isn't merely an anecdote. It's a rigorously controlled, formally published scientific experiment, demonstrating, beyond reasonable doubt, that a genuinely wild, completely undomesticated animal can learn to recognize one specific human signal among many competing sounds and respond to it with real, measurable, functionally accurate understanding of exactly what that signal means for mutual benefit. And once you know with certainty that at least one wild species is unambiguously capable of that level of interspecies communication, the broader pattern of wild animals occasionally seeking out humans during moments of genuine crisis becomes considerably less far-fetched and considerably more scientifically plausible as something rooted in real, if necessarily limited, cognitive understanding rather than pure coincidence or wishful human interpretation projected after the fact. Maybe it's a precise, narrow evolutionary mutualism, refined over countless generations of selective pressure, exactly like the relationship between the honey guide and the honey hunter. Maybe it's an individual animal's hard-won, deeply personal association between one specific place, one specific group of people, and the remembered relief from past pain. Maybe, in the most desperate cases of all, it's simply an overridden survival instinct in the moment, a calculated risk taken because every other available option has already run out, and there's genuinely nothing left to lose by trying. Whatever the precise mechanism turns out to be in each individual documented case, the broader pattern itself is remarkably consistent across the scientific and anecdotal record alike, spanning species that share almost nothing else meaningfully in common. Birds, mammals, marine animals, separated by tens of millions of years of independent evolutionary divergence, occasionally and independently arriving at the exact same desperate calculated decision when circumstances turn dire enough. When everything else fails, when the pain becomes too much to bear alone, and every instinct screams to run, hide, or simply endure it in isolation, some wild animals make a choice that quietly defies the very fear response we spent so much of our shared evolutionary history actively teaching them to feel toward us. They walk deliberately, against every ingrained instinct, toward the single most dangerous predator on the entire planet. Because sometimes, against every evolutionary lesson telling them otherwise, that exact predator turns out to be precisely what they need. If this changed the way you think about the animals around you, share it with someone who's never thought twice about why a wild creature might walk straight toward a stranger. This has been a look into the science and psychology behind interspecies trust. Not a final answer. A perspective grounded in the best evidence we currently have. If this hit you, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's next, and drop a comment with which story from this list surprised you the most. We'll see you in the next one. You said HTTPS.